Henry I was the earliest of our kings to make use of the Tower of London as a state prison. Randulf Flambard, Bishop of Durham, having the distinction of being its first prisoner. Henry, in order to curry popularity at the beginning of his reign, had Flambard arrested. The bishop, hated by the people for his rapacity, being accused of illegally raising the funds needed for the building of the fortress which was destined to become his prison. He was imprisoned with the king's sanction, but nominally by the will of the House of Commons, and thus inaugurated the long line of prisoners of state which, from the reign of Henry I until the early years of the 19th century, the Tower never lacked. Flambard had been the principal minister of Henry's predecessor, William Rufus. The Saxon chronicler, Vitalis, recounts that the bishop was allowed while in the Tower, to keep a sumptuous table for himself and his servants, a privilege which enabled him to escape from his prison in the following manner. He obtained a rope which had been hidden in a wine cask, and after liberally regaling his keepers, whom he succeeded in fuddling with much wine, he made fast the rope to a pillar of a chamber in the White Tower, or to the bar of a window, and let himself slide down, reaching the ground in safety. It was a wonderful feat Flambard performed, for he held his pastoral staff in his hand, as he descended the side of the tower. The rope proved too short and the bishop had a fall of several feet, but apparently without being the worse for it. A swift horse, provided by his friends, took him to the coast, whence he succeeded in reaching Normandy. Some years after his escape he returned to his see at Durham, where he completed that splendid cathedral, also building many other churches and castles, amongst the latter being Norham Castle, whose stately ruins have been lauded by Sir Walter Scott. It is uncertain whether any of the Norman kings before Stephen made the Tower a place of residence. But in 1140 that monarch, during a gloomy period of private and public affairs, retired to the Tower with a large retinue and kept his court there during Whitsuntide. The custody of the Tower appears, soon after its completion, to have been made an hereditary office, granted by the sovereign to the family of Mandeville. In this year of 1140 the Tower was in the keeping of Geoffrey, grandson of that great Geoffrey de Mandeville, who had accompanied the Conqueror to England, and who had greatly distinguished himself at the Battle of Hastings. Stephen created the grandson Earl of Essex, but being himself taken prisoner soon afterwards at the Battle of Lincoln, the Empress Matilda lured de Mandeville over to her party, during Stephen's captivity. By a charter, dated from Oxford in 1141, Matilda confirmed the Earl in all the possessions which he had inherited, whether in lands or fortresses, the custody of the Tower being included therein. Essex was given a free hand to strengthen and fortify it. A subsequent charter of the same year gave him the special charge of the Tower, with all lands, liveries, and customs thereto appertaining. According to Leland, de Mandeville constantly added to the fortifications of the Tower, but when he was defeated and taken prisoner at the Battle of St. Albans he was obliged to surrender the constableship into the hands of Stephen. In 1153 the Tower was held for the Crown by Richard de Lucy, Chief Justiciary of England, in trust for Henry, Duke of Normandy, to whom, after Stephen's death, it reverted. Matilda had offended the Londoners by refusing to abolish her father's laws, and by also refusing to restore those granted by Edward the Confessor, and, rising in arms, they drove the Empress from the city. Stephen having recovered his liberty, Matilda's power ceased shortly afterwards. After her flight the Londoners laid siege to the Tower, but it had been so strongly fortified by de Mandeville, that he was not only able to defy the besiegers' uttermost efforts to effect its capture, but was able to make a sortie as far as Fulham, where he took the Bishop of London prisoner, as then lodged there, being of the contrary faction. It is doubtful whether Henry I ever lived in the Tower, or whether he added to its fortifications. Thomas à Becket is supposed to have wished to have been made constable of the fortress as well as of Rochester Castle, which latter he is known to have held. Fitz-Stephen, in the reign of Henry II, describes the Arx Palatine as being then great and strong with encircling walls rising from a deep foundation, and built with mortar tempered with the blood of beasts. Probably the sanguinary aspect of the mortar used in the Tower buildings was owing to the use of pulverized Roman red tiles and bricks, of which a large quantity were most likely pounded into mortar. When Richard Coeur de Lion left England for the Holy Land he entrusted the charge of guarding the Tower to Longchamp, Bishop of Ely, who was his chancellor. This bishop strengthened the fortress and deepened the moat. He had good reason for his work upon the fortress, for John, taking advantage of his brother's absence, besieged the tower, but the bishop, thinking discretion the better part of valor, yielded up his trust without attempting to defend it, and fled for safety to Dover Castle. John made over the tower to the confederated nobles under the Archbishop of Rouen, who occupied it until Richard's return from the Holy Land. In 1215, the barons, who were then up in arms, aided by the London citizens, besieged the tower, but although it was poorly garrisoned, their attacks were repelled. A year later, whilst the civil war was waging between John and his barons, the tower was handed over to the French Prince Louis by the rebellious nobles, who had invited him to take John's place as King of England, but Louis does not seem to have taken kindly to the position, and speedily returned to his own land. In 1217, Henry III was reigning in undisputed possession of the realm, and to him belongs the credit of having done more towards making the tower worthy of a royal abode, than any of his predecessors or successors upon the English throne. The most stately of its buildings, after the Great Keep, are due to his love of art and architecture. The Royal Chapel, the Great Hall, and the Palace Chambers, which he either built or decorated, are frequently mentioned in the chronicles of Henry's reign, and were the outcome of his taste and love of magnificence. In 1232 the tower was given into the custody for life to the famous Hubert de Burgh, Earl of Kent. His constableship, however, was brief, he being supplanted by Peter de Roches, Bishop of Winchester, and imprisoned in the fortress he had formerly governed. It was during the reign of Henry III that the newly built tower over the Traitor's Gate twice fell. The first time this happened was on the night of St. George's Day, 23rd of April, in 1240, and on the same anniversary in the following year the structure again sank into the moat. According to the historian Matthew Paris, the spirit of St. Thomas à Becket was the cause of both these mishaps, the saint returning from the home of the blessed to the rescue of his beloved and persecuted London citizens, who had looked on the ever-increasing fortifications and massive walls of the royal stronghold, with much the same distrust and irritation as the fortress of the Bastille caused the Parisians. 4 years later, the son of the great Welsh chieftain and patriot, Llewellyn, was killed whilst attempting to escape from the White Tower in a similar manner as that by which Bishop Flambard had succeeded in ending his captivity. Matthew Paris relates that the unlucky Welsh prince was discovered at the foot of the White Tower with his head thrust in between his shoulders. The rope, by which he had hoped to escape had broken, and he had been dashed to death in the fall. During his long and agitated reign Henry III was frequently obliged to take shelter within the tower from his rebellious subjects. When Simon de Montfort and the barons rose against his rule and encamped themselves near Richmond, Henry took refuge in the tower with his eldest son Edward's wife, Eleanor of Provence. Edward had been fighting Llewellyn in Wales, and hearing of the dangerous situation of his wife and father, hurried back to London, throwing himself into Windsor Castle. Eleanor of Provence made an attempt to join her husband at Windsor, but the London citizens were strongly on the side of the rebels, and when the princess's barge reached London Bridge on its way down the river it was stopped by a rabble who pelted it with stones, mud, and rotten eggs, and heaped the foulest abuse upon its royal occupant, who was forced to take shelter once more in the tower. Edward is believed never to have forgiven the Londoners for this treatment of his wife, and his harshness to the city during his reign was probably due to this incident. 2 years afterwards the mutinous barons seized the tower, which they occupied until the Battle of Evesham, in 1264, enabled Henry to return to his favourite stronghold. Once again the king was driven into war by Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester, who summoned Otho, the papal legate, then within the tower, to surrender it into his hands, declaring that the tower was not a post to be trusted in the hands of a foreigner, much less of an ecclesiastic. The legate defied the earl to do his worst, and refused to surrender either the fortress or himself into Gloucester's keeping. This priest appears to have been not only brave, but somewhat rash, for although the city was at that time in the power of de Clare, he left the tower when a siege was imminent, and preached a sermon at St. Paul's, inveighing against the earl. A siege ensued, during which, according to Matthew of Westminster, a number of Jews, then within the tower, defended one of its wards with great courage, and the king's army arriving opportunely, the fortress was saved from falling into the hands of the earl.